I was born and grew up in Saskatchewan, Canada, and middle of nowhere. We always joke about that. Growing up, just part of the city, and my father had been in the army before I was born. I got my way through high school, decided I wanted to focus on medicine, and I'd started doing an undergraduate degree in science. And it was around that time that my grandmother had died, and I'd gotten into medical school. And my dad had told me earlier on, "Oh, son, think about joining the military." And I said, "Dad, I'm a lover, not a fighter. That's not what I would do." And he'd been in the army. But then, getting into medical school and realizing there was a bit of a price tag at the end of it all, I thought, well, I'm going to look into this. My grandmother had died, and I ended up traveling overseas and meeting a lot of Australians and Americans, people from Europe, and I realized this is something I could actually do. So when I went back to medical school, I decided to join up, and that was back in 1990. Went through medical school, did some time in Ottawa, went to Halifax, and started on a ship for 2.5 years. Took from the west coast of Canada around to the east coast, and I really, really enjoyed it. But along the journey, along my medical school journey, I met a girl from Melbourne, and she was over working for a year, and after meeting her, we decided to stay together and got married over there, had a child over there, and then it was the time for her to come home. And I thought, well, the way I could do that would be to transfer as a doctor, as a general practitioner, as a family doctor, and not really understanding the medical system here, I thought I do understand Navy. So I started approaching that and transferred from the Canadian Navy. Effectively had to get out completely, and then had a bit of a hiatus before coming over to Australia in 1998. We'll clarify a bit about the transfer bit, because it was that I did join the Australian Navy before I came to Australia. Well, how that happened, there were two phases of that. Being as a doctor, we were almost like blacklisted. We didn't need them in Australia unless you went to certain areas. So the Defence Force had an agreement with the Department of Immigration to say, hey, we want to bring in this person. So it was going to be relatively seamless until someone had forgotten to renew that contract. So then I said, oh, I'm married to an Australian and we have a child. How does that change things? I spoke to the High Commission, and they said, just send us your passport. You're immediately a permanent resident, and then I could get the ball rolling again. And then they flew an Australian officer up from San Diego, who's on exchange, to Vancouver, who then signed me into the Royal Australian Navy. And then I got on an aircraft, landed in Melbourne, and that was my entry as a permanent resident to Australia. So that was easy, and they paid for it all. So that was a very good thing, and I knew I had a job. On arrival, it was December, so I went to the base, met my new boss, whom and pretty much identified, go get your uniform. We're about to go on reduced activity period, was what was known as back then. I didn't even know what that was, which meant that the base essentially went down to minimal manning, and most people were on leave, but I hadn't accrued any leave. So she goes, that's okay, you just go on leave and you come back in January and you'll have a job. So that transition was quite nice with a young child and finding a place to live. We were put up in a hotel awaiting a Department of, or a Human Services place, a DHA home, sorry, and that was helpful to transition that way. And then really on entry, I felt very at home. The Navy, the service life, having already been 9 years in defense in Canada, that was the commonality. The difference as a doctor was that although I was a fully qualified family physician over in Canada, when I came to Australia, my credentials had been assessed by the Victorian licensing agency at that point, but I was on a restriction of my registration until I had done the Australian Medical Council exams. So that was the transition for me, having been a fully qualified doctor going to sea, doing all the things you would normally do, to now being under supervision again and having to sit exams to prove that I knew what I was doing. So I had to do all that, and I worked out at HMAS Cerberus for essentially a year and a half while getting through those exams, working on the ward at the health center, teaching at the medical school where we train our medics, and doing a few shifts in the emergency department to understand the health system from external to defense. So my very first provider number was at Frankston Hospital, which is now where I still work as a consultant surgeon.
I lived down there.
I lived down in Victoria, but not quite in Frankston, but yes. Yeah, so that was my transition, just getting to know people, having to go on all the courses, doing officer training. Having already been fully trained as an officer, they gave me a bit of an out They call it a lateral entry officer's course and a qualified entry officer's course, so smaller duration than the others and very bespoke. I was top of my class because I was the only one in it. And they gave me a tour around to Sydney and Canberra to just meet people and get a bit of the lay of the land. And getting through all the exams, after a year and a half, I then transferred up to the Submarine and Underwater Medicine Unit in Sydney at HMAS Penguin. Well, the skill set I actually had in the Canadian Navy. So I was an advanced diving medical officer there, and I was also a diving officer running my own dive team for my ship. So when I came to Australia, that was a career focus for me and a path. I identified that early. So to get that job in Sydney, it is focusing really on underwater medicine, which includes anything that goes under the water, submarines and divers. So at the Underwater Medicine Unit in Sydney, that was primarily focused on diving. We had, at that time, the RAN, the Royal Australian Navy Diving School, now known as the ADF Diving School, right next to us. We were right on the water in Mossman, and that role there was as a primary healthcare doctor and there to run resuscitations for stricken divers, take them to the recompression chamber if need be. I had a group of underwater medics working with me, and that was our entire focus. We were just down the hill from the Balmoral Naval Hospital, and our focus was purely on diving. The unit itself at that stage was the only submarine underwater medicine unit. We had a submarine escape training facility over in the West Coast, and that was kind of the offset. So we were the bigger unit with the diving focus, and the submarine escape training facility was where they did the pressurized escape training. And so we needed to have doctors and medical sailors there that were underwater medicine trained to manage those people if they got injured. So the bends really is decompression illness. So it's someone who's been at depth for a period of time. They've onboarded nitrogen during the dive, and as they come up, the nitrogen bubbles come out of solution and cause problems in the tissues that the bubbles expand into. So they're taking on nitrogen as they come down because they're breathing gas at pressure, and that's just coming onto their body. So as they come up through the water column, that then exposes or can dissipate and cause problems in the joints, in the soft tissues, in the spinal cord, in the nerves, in the brain. So any of these symptoms that come on surfacing, we would then identify, we would assess them and decide that yes, they've had the bends or decompression illness, and we will then take them to the recompression chamber for treatment. There are other conditions that can come through, air gas embolisms that can go up, so a bubble that comes through the circulation and it can go into the brain or into any other area, and that can be related to problems in their heart where they had a hole in their heart that we weren't aware of. These types of things can happen, or a person's been panicked at depth and they raise to the surface and they're holding their breath and they overpressure their lungs and rupture their lungs and cause that air embolus that way. So there's lots of different injuries that can occur, and then just trauma in general. They could be hit by a propeller, there can be shark attack, etc. So a whole variety of venomous creatures or dangerous creatures in the sea, standard injury, but the decompression illness that we recompress or take into the hyperbaric chamber is what we would do to then let the nitrogen get out of their system so we can get them back up to the surface again. Anything deeper than 10 meters is 1 atmosphere. And if you're down there long enough, you're going to onboard enough nitrogen that can cause the problem. So all the recreational divers as well as military divers will plan their dive so that they avoid that risk. But in the military diving and operational diving, they sometimes do have to go deeper for longer. We might use different gas mixes so that they can stay down longer without that risk. But that's why we have them in the Navy and why it's important for continuing to have a submarine and underwater medicine unit for Australian Navy. In general, if a submarine is stricken, is in distress, cannot surface for whatever reason, it's had a collision, it's lost power, and it's at depth, or it's had a fire, they've been in enemy action, whatever reason, and the sailors that are there cannot get that submarine to come back to the surface, then they have to do an escape. They're at depth now, and they'll be at significant depths. We're not talking 10 or 20 meters. They're going to be at hundreds of meters down. And for them to escape, they would go up to a conning tower. They flood that tower. They then, through the hatch, release themselves and have a pressurizing or a suit that will take them up to the surface where they can actually have a bit of breathing. But for them, they're breathing compressed air because they're inside the submarine, and they then will go up. If they held their breath, as would be the standard, then their lungs would rupture and they wouldn't be surviving that ascent. And what we used to train was in the water column on how to do that, how to get into the flood chamber, don the suit to get out, and then how to go up through the water column while exhaling the entire time, because the gas is expanding in your lungs. So you just have to keep things open, let blow the bubbles. So back when I joined that unit, that was still happening in the West Coast, and we were training people. The whole world was still training people like that. Over time, we've identified that still causes injury to people, and it's not necessarily the thing that we need to train them to do. So now we can do that training at a very 1 meter depth, so that they're just going along a water column. They're understanding how that works, but they're going horizontally instead of vertically. That was the first of our border protection events when the potential illegal immigrant vessels were coming in through the Indian Ocean. That was 2001. Another very, very significant event, of course, happened in 2001, and I was at sea during that time. But that Operation Relax was the border protection that we see now in Op Resolute. So when potential illegal immigrant vessels are coming down, or suspected illegal entry vessels, CEVs, we were there to stop the boats from coming through, intercepting and sending them back, if we could, to where they came from. For any of them coming through, they would have been at sea for a varying amount of time. They may have been fleeing persecution in other areas, so they may have already had some injuries or illnesses, chronic conditions. Obviously, in the Defence Force, we have a narrowed age range of people that we normally take care of, so this was an additional challenge, and why it's good to be a general practitioner and a family doctor, because there'd be children, there would be pregnant women, newborns, there would be elderly people with significant chronic conditions, and then all the risks of malnutrition, dehydration, viruses, even I suppose scurvy, but I didn't see that. But any of the injuries that could occur from that time if they were in rough seas. So we assessed their health, we managed their health, and then either brought them into Christmas Island as a detention facility, and then they were managed along the political lines of the day, or if possible, we would return them to where they had come from. The Warramunga deployment that we talked about in Op Relax was the beginning of my transition from being a general practitioner family doctor into becoming a surgeon or orthopedic surgeon. And when I stepped off Warramunga in January of 2002, I then entered into the civilian public hospital system to enter into surgical training. So at that stage, I was still permanent Navy, and I was in this new program known as the Medical Officer Specialist Training Scheme that allowed for us to remain in permanent service in the three services, Army, Air Force, Navy, and we would go and try and get into a training program. And if you were successful, then at the end of that training program, similar to our undergraduate program, we had a period of time that we had to pay back as a specialist. And that core group of specialists at that time was an orthopedic surgeon, general surgeon, anesthetist, emergency physician, and intensive care physicians. Those were the three in the surgical sphere and 2 in the critical care sphere. That was what we were training up for the whole of defense. So I was the first person that went into that training, into that program. By the time that actually got me into the program was in 2004. And that program is signed off and approved by Admiral Barry in 2001. So really from my time in Warramunga up until completing my orthopedic surgical training in January 2008, I was essentially in the training environment, didn't do anything other than regular communication with my chain of command, but didn't have to do any deployment. But as soon as I finished, then I was the first full-time trained specialist that had come through that training program. And I had, it sounds minimal, it was 24 months of return of service obligation for that amount of time out, but it was designed to be part-time leave without pay, which meant you could organize how much or how little you did. I chose to do 2 days a week in the military setting and 3 days a week in the civilian hospital system, and that's how I divided it up. So I was only really getting paid 40% of my wage, and that meant that 24 months extended out to being about 4.5 years. And during that time, I then began deploying quite regularly, going with exercises and operations. There was Operation Penang Assist in 2009 aboard HMAS Kanimbla after the earthquake offshore. And did a lot of exercises that we just tend to do every year, every second year, Talisman Sabres, these types of things. And then in 2010, I was selected, I was the backup for an Air Force surgical team, and I went to replace the orthopedic surgeon at that point at relatively short notice in early 2010. So that was my first trip to Afghanistan. I was in Tarin Kowt. Didn't last much longer than 4 weeks. In fact, I know it was exactly 29 days because there's medallic recognition that happens at day 30 that I didn't achieve in that one. But that was a very first time that I had an opportunity to be the deployed orthopedic surgeon in a war zone, and pretty much what my career had been leading up to. So it was a very important and transitional time as a military surgeon. And that was in 2010. I deployed to Papua New Guinea with the Army as part of their deployed capability in an exercise, international exercise. And I just continued to deploy that way, usually 2 or 3 times a year on Navy exercises, Army exercises, and then had the big call up in 2012 where I was selected to be the senior medical advisor to the Joint Task Force headquarters over in the Middle East. So we were running the entire Australian contingent in the Middle East. I was there as that senior doctor or senior medical advisor. And later that same year, I went for another 4 months at the Royal 3 Hospital in Kandahar. It was NATO, but it was run by the U.S. Navy. And that was a big calendar year, 2012, where I spent about 7.5 months away from home. We were there supporting the Netherlands hospital, the Royal 2E hospital, and because the surgeon I was replacing had been injured, they couldn't really do their role. They then had to leave the area, and it meant that the other surgeon, the general surgeon, had to kind of cover both aspects of surgery, and it was a bit of an issue, I suppose. So when I came in, because of operational secrecy, we don't advertise when you're moving in and out, so they didn't know when I was coming. I flew in one of our military aircraft with some other people coming in, and it was very quick to land. There's always the risk of air attack from ground to air. So you come in and you dive down and you land, and I'm like, oh, this is the big deal. And you're in body armor systems, you've got all that. And that wasn't unfamiliar to me, but as a Navy guy, you don't tend to do a lot of that. My Canadian Armed Forces background had me doing a bit more land-based activities in the past. So some of it was familiar, but I'd never been to a war zone before, so that was daunting. In fact, for my family, especially my wife at that point, we had all 4 of our children, and that was a big deal for me to be going away at that stage with a young family. So it was emotionally different, but it was exciting because I knew I was going to do what I was there to do. All my colleagues in orthopedic surgery can do what I do from a trauma and orthopedic point of view. It's just they're not the ones that go forward, and just a few of us are fortunate enough, I guess, to have that opportunity. It was a containerized hospital solution that the Netherlands ran. We had one dedicated operating theater that we tended to use the most. There was a second operating theater that we could extend into. We had a very small, so it was the Australian Defence Force that provided the surgical and intensive care team, but small, so one surgical team and enough to provide intensive care for 2 beds, and that's what we were there to do. So it was austere, that's what we call it when we are in the middle of nowhere. You don't have everything you would ever need, but we were lucky. We had the operating theater, we had the sterilization systems, we had a good group of people working in the hospital. We had our radiographer that could do x-rays and ultrasounds. We didn't have a CT scanner there. So you don't have everything you need, or that you want, I suppose, but for me as a trauma orthopedic surgeon, I had everything that I needed to do my job. There's always risks of rocket attack and complex attacks. So there's aspects of it that are challenging. In a war zone, we would often be required to have a weapon system with us at all times. But because we were working within the Netherlands hospital, those of us from the Australian Defence Force that worked there, we didn't carry weapons because the Dutch didn't carry weapons. But the rest of the compound that had Australians in them kind of looked at us and go, where are your weapons? So that was something also to get used to. That's the first time that I'd had to worry or consider having a weapon. with me. There were rocket attacks, I wouldn't say daily, but quite regularly. So we had drills that we were used to, nothing else untoward. We weren't overly busy, but we weren't not busy, if that makes sense. And we were dealing not just with military, but also with civilian from the local area. So it gave you a breadth of experience that we didn't necessarily see in other deployments, because there was more regularity of managing civilians from the local area that had been maybe injured 3 or 6 months prior and still had external fixation devices, so the rods and pins on the outside of the body that were still there, so I could manage that. Or we would get newly injured individuals that we would have to manage and help. We had pagers. We didn't always have phones with us. You'd find out what you needed to know. When I was there, I was the senior Australian in that group of 8 people. So I had a reporting requirement for any things, and I had the connectivity with my higher command in Australia. And what I found is I would learn about potential threats of complex attacks. So I would tell my team, so we've been told if we're going up to the hospital, we have to wear our body armor to walk up there. Some places, in other places and times, that was standard anyway. But in this compound, it wasn't. And so we did that, and my U.S. colleagues were looking at us going, what are you doing? And I said, well, and then I'd have to brief the executive officer and commanding officer of the NATO Royal 3 Hospital, say, this is what I've heard, behind closed doors, this is what I've heard from my command. I'm not sure if you're getting any of those feeds from your command, but I've heard that there's a heightened risk at the moment. So there were certainly times that I felt more at risk, more at threat than other deployments that I've been on, and there were times that these things had happened in Afghanistan, in that base, and did happen to friends of mine while they were deployed in subsequent deployments. So it was a bit scary. There was a market that would come once, I think on the weekends, and so just outside the gate. So we were allowed, there would be guards there. We would go out, they would have their wares. We could meet them and buy whatever they were selling if we were interested in that. And many of the locals would then potentially gain employment within the hospital or in the compound as interpreters or as service providers. So we did get to see a few of the Afghanistan people. Going out to any of the markets, you feel a bit more exposed. You're then outside the compound or just outside the gate. But even going along the perimeter, if we would go for a run, so the Netherlands, the Dutch like their runs as well. So we do the 5 English mile and 10 English mile runs. And so you'd be running along the perimeter, and you knew that there could be snipers out there watching you. They have their scopes. So I guess you had that hypervigilance, and if you met people, you'd be worried about someone who was going to do you harm. So that's part of that, I guess, when you transition back into civilian life after you've been deployed, that you have to learn to calm that suspicion a bit down. But yeah, you do have to be vigilant. Oh, it was very interesting to see just sand and dust, really. It was the dust of Uruzgan. So it was a very stark difference from what I grew up with in Saskatchewan, what I was living in Australia before I deployed. So that was big sky. I'm used to that from Saskatchewan, but nothing like what I saw there. And the dust got into everything. And I was a bit of a runner, still am a bit of a runner, not as much as I used to be. And going around, if vehicles went past you, it was like talcum powder, and you'd breathe it into your lungs, it would get into everything. So that was a bit of a challenge and a bit different. And when you're also considering I'm there to do a job as a surgeon, we want to be as clean and as sterile as possible. It was continual that we would be cleaning dust, even though we were in containers, not tents. It was still challenging to maintain and make sure that we were as sterile as possible. I've got to say the Australian Defence Force is amazing at the amount of infrastructure they put to allow for that. They understand how important it is for people to have connectivity. My first times in the Canadian Navy, when I went to sea, it was see you later, and I wouldn't have any communication, not even email, until I got to a foreign port. But here, in the middle of a war zone, I had computers that set us up to do Skype calls. We had telephone availability, so you just pick a phone and dial as if you were in Australia, the area code and number, and you were speaking to your family like it was next door. And it was very impressive. I found that my kids were probably better with me on the telephone than the video, because in the video they were at the age where they were watching themselves in the video rather than me, and rather than talking with me, they were just making funny faces in the video. But no, it was quite good to be able to see and interact with the family from that distance, and was very appreciative, as was my family, with that type of support that we got from Australia. The family were kind of used to me being away. I found it's just an anecdotal story, but a poignant one. When I was in the States, we were in New York, and they had just opened up the Pools of Remembrance. And I was there with my family, and my daughter, now how old was she at the time? She would have been 12. And we had a photo taken, and she goes, no, we've got to take that again. And why? You look fine. No, she goes, no, I was smiling, and I shouldn't be smiling here. And then for the younger ones, I could explain to them that the reason why Dad's away is what happened here in 2001. And that was very interesting. So I think the family were on board with all that, but I do know it affected them by the time I came back after those 7.5 months away, for sure. The normal day would be a normal day. You'd go to bed, you'd wake up, have your PT, and then breakfast and meet up and do an outpatient clinic. See some of the locals, anybody that we had operated on that was still in the hospital at that point. We had a few ward areas. We would go do our clinical rounds, meet up with staff, get a briefing from the command team of the hospital as to what was expected and planned for the day. If we had known surgical cases, we would get on and do those, and that wasn't uncommon. If you had someone that was injured, you'd usually take them back to the operating theater the next day. So we would have those. We would then do some training. And because we were working with other countries, we also have a Singaporean team with us as well. We would be interacting with them, and there was the local compound. Within the compound, we had the Australian, two different groups of Australians, so we would interact with them, and then the clinical people, we would interact with them. So a standard day was kind of like that. And then after hours, there might be an ability to watch a movie, get together, people play a video game, play poker. We played a lot of poker with the Dutch, but not for anything other than fun, bragging rights. But yeah.
Presuming you had shift work as well as part of the daily routine.
Yeah, for the nursing and medic staff that were caring for people overnight, they'd be in shift. Because I was an N of 1, there was only one orthopedic surgeon there. Then I was on call 24/7. So I tended to do as we do anywhere. We will just work during the day. So kind of a day worker who's on call. Someone comes in injured, there's a concern with someone who's admitted, they give you a call, they come wake you up. And earlier in 2012, having been at the UAE for that 3.5 months, I had a break of about 6 weeks where I went back to Australia, then took my family over to Canada and the States to visit my mother, and to visit my brother and my sister-in-law, and we did a lot of these things. So I had this lovely break, and then I just went back, and all my gear was still there. I just locked it up in a cage in the UAE, and then I could take that forward with me to Afghanistan. So we always stop in at that transition base on our way through to any point of deployment in the Middle East. And then, because I had the cage there, the person that I had handed over to in that J07 or senior medical advisor role was still there. So I was able to catch up with them, see how they were doing in their job, and then met up with the group of people that I went in there with. They didn't belong to me. We were just a group of 8 of us that went in. We had 2 anesthetists, the general surgeon, orthopedic surgeon, 2 ICU nurses, and 2 anesthetic or perioperative nurses that went in at that time. So we all met up together. If we didn't know one another, we got to know each other there, and then we did our bit of our reception, staging, and onward integration training, and then went forward into Kandahar. And then from there, had to be integrated and trained to enter into the U.S. Navy-led hospital. That was the NATO hospital there. So that was just again, like anywhere, orienting yourself. Where am I living? How do I find my way around? Who am I working with? And at that point, we were all embedded within our teams of our specialties. So I was there with, I think, 6 or 7 other orthopedic surgeons from the U.S. Navy. So I got to meet them. The trauma surgeon that organized all of the surgery went there. We just started meeting our teams, doing some training, but it wasn't long before the first casualties started coming through. And as we were getting there, getting our IDs sorted, our access sorted, we would then observe our U.S. colleagues and then help them out to understand their systems, because we also then were working within their computer system, within their supply system, understand their surgical instruments, understand their clinical practice guidelines. And a lot of us we had learned about those beforehand, and because I'd been the senior doc or the senior health advisor bringing people in for the first rotation, I knew what we needed to know. So I told the people that I was deploying with, read up on these. They're on the internet. This is how you access them. They're open access. Learn this because this is what our U.S. colleagues are going to be working towards, and we need to then be part of that team and learn those things. So that was that transition. But we came in August, and within hours we were there when our outgoing team was there. So there was a handover time as well for about a week. So my offsider that was Australian orthopedic surgeon, I got a handover from her, and then we saw them at the end of their deployment. Got to learn a few things from them. They would tell us their transition, what they learned during their 4 months there, and then we just took on that aspect from there on. Kandahar province, and it's south of Afghanistan towards the Pakistan border. So we were down south, and next to us there was a Role 3 hospital in Helmand province that was run by the UK or the Great Britain. So they had their hospital, and we had ours. But we were the only hospital in the southern Afghanistan that had neurosurgeon as well. That's what defined our Role 3. They were a Role 3 because of size and scope, but they didn't have a neurosurgeon with them, the British. So we would get all the neurosurgical trauma as well.
And was Kandahar a base?
Kandahar was a multinational base, yeah. When I went to Kandahar, the Canadian Forces had been running the hospital there before, when it was a kind of a tent and reinforced Hesca wall place. Then when they made the brick and mortar and handed that over through NATO, it was transitioned. So it was almost better than a hospital in Australia. It was purpose-built for trauma. So it was designed with the trauma flow from a resuscitation bay or emergency department straight through. Right next, they had 2 CT scanners. They had interventional radiologists. They had then 12 bays of resuscitation. And then straight through, you could go directly into the intensive care unit or to the operating theater, depending where you needed to go. And then there was a general services ward. But it was, you would think you were in a hospital in Australia. And when I went in there, the anesthetic machines were the same ones that we used at Frankston Hospital. It was amazing how non-austere that felt. And because it was such a large facility, we had pretty much everything that we needed and more. We were in the Role 3 in Kandahar, and that was the multinational base of Kandahar, but that was the province as well. I'm sure that there's a township named Kandahar as well. I didn't really get out and about much, I must say, but the base itself was massive, multinational. Many of the countries you can think of would be there. There were 9 different, I think, dining facilities that you could go to that had different themes. It was big, very, very big place. There was kind of almost like a central village area that had the shops, so that's where you would meet some of the local shopkeepers. They also had weekly markets just outside, so you could go to the markets. So there was a lot of that, and they had fast food outlets, they had coffee shops, they had ice cream shops. Like it was such a big base. That one was totally different than Tarin Kowt. When we had the Australian compound, Australians are great with the barbecue concept, so we had this beautiful outdoor barbecue. They had somehow brought grass in and kept it green and alive, and it was about the only grass that was around in Kandahar. So for then inviting your coalition colleagues to come into the base, we'd have to go through a process of doing so, but they loved it, and so we could invite them in for a backyard barbecue type of concept. We had, when I was there at that time of year, we had a Remembrance Day, so I asked for representation from the U.S. Navy members of the hospital to come in and be my guests and lay a wreath and say a few words, and it became a really nice coalition interaction. So those were the things that we could do. Recreation-wise, though, to get back to that question, there were always recreation centers where you could go read, watch a movie, play cards. There was gymnasiums, multiple there, so it would be the heavy lifting gyms, and there would also be the cardio gyms. There would be gym classes and PTIs running that. With that many different nations, different languages, different expectations, and tensions, there can be issues, but I didn't see much of that, to be honest. Most people either stayed within their country, or you got to know people in a different way. There were other cultural things. It's one of those things I probably shouldn't even say because my kids didn't like it, but we had a cigar club, and we would be next to the runway in the evenings. We would only do it on a Friday, or that was the standard thing. We would get what we call near beer, because of course we're not allowed to drink, and there was the near beers, and we'd have pizzas, and we'd be there, and we would be interacting with all the people from the hospital who weren't on shift and on call. Or you could be on call, but you weren't on shift, and we would be out there engaging in that social atmosphere, and that was great. And that translated to other deployments that I did that became a nice way of counting off the weeks. And you could watch a movie together and have just some outdoor interaction and relaxation. I didn't see too much tension from that aspect. We worked collegially together quite well. From a health perspective, we tried to minimize that by having the clinical practice guidelines that we ran, and we would have weekly conferences, not just with our hospital, but with all the other hospitals. So from the point of injury coming in, so we try to minimize the disruptions or the lack of understanding. In the base itself, it's something that I guess non-health people would fully understand, but you can imagine you go in for a surgery or a procedure, there's a time frame that it's going to take, and you just get through it and it's all fine. If you've been badly injured in a war zone, you've lost multiple limbs and you're losing blood, and what you need is to get someone to stop the bleeding, and you need to get into an intensive care unit to be rewarmed and get your physiology normalized. When people are that badly injured, we would have multiple teams operating on them at the same time. It wasn't do one operation, then do another operation, then do another operation. We would have an orthopedic surgeon or two per limb. We would have general surgeons operating in the abdomen and in the chest, and we'd have the neurosurgeons working on the head and the maxillofacial surgeon working on the face with the ophthalmologist, all happening all at the same time, so that we would have multiple anesthetic teams, we'd have multiple scrub teams. So almost everybody, it was a full court press, the whole team was there. But by doing so, we were able to clean up all the debris and all the contamination, stop the bleeding, warm the patient, resuscitate them, give them blood, and then get them to the intensive care unit. So what we could do there, it was quite incredible. Like, you wouldn't see that really anywhere else because we were all there. We were captive audiences in a sense, but we had no other reason to be there than to do that type of work. Was it sustainable? Well, yeah, we all sustained it, but if we had to do it 24/7, we wouldn't be able to. So usually the surge of casualties came in during the day, and you'd operate all day, and you'd have multiple operating theaters running at the same time, and then you'd finish up and we'd go for an ice cream or just go for a meal and decompress for the day. And we had standards that we wanted to achieve, and these are things that are in the public domain. But if we would say that we wanted to ensure that someone who's been injured gets first aid buddy care within that first 10 minutes, they are going to be there. Within an hour, they're at a definitive facility, or within 2 hours, they're in a surgical facility if that's what they need. We tried to ensure that they, from point of injury to arriving at our facility, was within 1 hour. So we were really pushing that envelope because we knew that the sooner they got to us, the sooner we could get to fixing what was wrong with them. The pervading statistics that I kept on hearing while I was over there, I can't validate, but this is what we were told. And 98% of people, if they arrived to the Royal 3 Hospital in Kandahar with a pulse, would survive. Now, that's however that is obtained, that stat, the reality was that if they did get to us and they still did have a pulse, they had a great opportunity to survive their injuries and get home to their loved ones. And that's what was our point of pride. So the occasional time that did not occur, the whole hospital was in mourning, because we are there to win, and we are perfectionists, and we want to ensure that our patients come through our system, they get treated as best as we can possibly do in our situation. I think one of the motto was best care anywhere, and it was great. So the dust off and the PJs, they would go and pick up the casualties from point of injury, or that was coordinated by the headquarters. The Patient Evacuation Coordination Center would send out their rotary wing assets. If they were operated on in Tarin Kowt, where I had been 2 years previous, we still had surgical teams there. We had surgical teams throughout Afghanistan. They might have been a casualty that went there first, but because of the nature of their injuries or because of the holding policy of those facilities, they were then rapidly transitioned to us because we had a large, I think it was a 30-bed ward. We had a 12-bed ICU. We had the capacity to hold those patients, but even we didn't want to hold them for very long because we would fill up. So within 24 to 48 hours, we would have aircraft taking these extremely injured people away through an evacuation chain that would take them back to Germany and then back to wherever their home country was. I still like the fact that I was there in an Australian uniform. I think that was what an Australian soldier who was injured, or any service member that was injured, if they saw Australian uniforms there looking after them, they felt that greater level of assurance. I touched upon being the senior person and therefore had the reporting requirements. That was then more of an issue when an Australian was significantly injured, and that did happen very early on in my deployment, where and I was the on-call orthopedic surgeon with the team of, at that point I think we only had 5 other orthopedic surgeons, so there's 6 of us. I was on call. We'd had 12 or 13 multi-amputation casualties coming through that day, a bad day in the war for us. And then after all that had happened, I then found out we were pretty much done. Everyone was just finished and showered and getting out of there. And then I got a call that an Australian had been injured and was in Tarankout and was on his way to us. So then, okay, that's it, they all mean as much, but this one means more because now there's an additional. This is the same uniform. This that kindred spirit. So from there, then was back in the operating theater into the evening, and this individual had already been operated on once, but we had to operate on him again. And we didn't really wake him up, went to the ICU because he was going to fly out the next day. I've subsequently met up with him, and that's been a great reunion, and we, I've been able to have him come to speak at medical conferences and that type of thing. So that was an amazing, heart-wrenching, but a pride to say that I'm there on behalf of Australia. And I've done these kinds of roles before, but this was a special one. And thankfully, we didn't get very many significantly injured Australians, but when we did, it had that additional feel to it. I recently was in the United States at a conference for the Society of Military Orthopedic Surgeons, of which I actually am there as the international representative. And during that conference, there was a group that were the trade exhibitors. I met them at the welcome reception. I went to their booth. I went to a luncheon that they were putting on. I just kind of got to know them quite well. And I identified that they were all veterans, and one had lost both his lower extremities, or lost one. And I just chatted to him after this luncheon, and we started talking, and I don't know why, maybe I had a sixth sense, but anyway, we started talking, and I said, well, so where were you? I was so-and-so. And when were you there? And oh, so you would have gone to the UK hospital? No, I went to Kandahar. Oh, okay. So then we realized, okay, that was 2012, and I was there in 2012. It was around November, he said. So I was there. So we were actually in the war zone in the same hospital, and I'm like, oh, mate, I may have actually operated on you. So then we look at each other, start crying, big hug, get a photo. And then I went back. He was driving back to Texas, and this was in Arizona. I went back to my hotel room, and I looked up my logbook, and I sent him a text message that said, if you are this call sign, I was your surgeon on the day, and I operated on you the next day as well. And it was like, blow me away. Those are the kinds of things that you never expect. But he then sends me the photo of a family. I think he's got about 10 kids. And he goes, they wouldn't have been here without you, Doc. And we stay in contact. It's not why I do it, but it is why I do it. I would never expect to ever meet any of my patients again. You always hope and assume that they live productive, happy lives. But in both those instances, at the very beginning of my deployment, very, very early on, was an Australian whom I respect greatly, who's gone on to great things here in Australia. And then I'd never, until a few months ago, would never know. This guy happened to be the last patient I operated on in Kandahar. The last day of I was redeploying a few days later. And I met up with him 10 years later, 10 years later, almost exactly. when I met him. So
That's a
it's
great
incredible.
story.
Because I'd been deployed so much in the Navy beforehand, we'd always had these ideas of how the household ran when I was home and when I wasn't home. And having a very, very independent and capable wife who just said, "That's okay, you're not here, I'm just going to make things happen," I then came back feeling I'm additional, I'm getting in the way here. So those were always the transitions coming back, especially that year being away that long. It was even more so that. That year, I do recall coming back and getting back into the hospital system. So the reunion was amazing, and I was fine, and I didn't have any of the hypervigilance. I guess I'm just lucky that way. But it was going back to the hospital and doing an operation, an elective operation on a foot, and going, this is almost cosmetic procedures, and I know so many people that I've just operated on that would like to have a foot still there, that they wouldn't be worried about the fact that, for the reason that I'm doing that surgery. And that was a thing that hit me. But the transition back, maybe I'm just lucky or stupid, I don't know what it is, but I seem to transition okay back into it. But it was the family dynamic that I did feel, as the family learned to be without me, to come back in and slot back in to help out, and sometimes maybe overcompensating and trying to help out too much and then upsetting the balance that had already been there when I wasn't there. So those were the types of things that were challenging. And the younger that the children are, the more that's the case. The older ones remember you better, and when you come in, you slot back in a little bit easier. But again, dynamics, I've got 2 daughters and 2 sons, so it's a different dynamic there, and the girls are older, the boys are younger. So all those dynamics were quite challenging, but it's a minefield, it can be. And that's a horrible thing to say when we talk about IEDs, but it is challenging, but it's something that you learn to navigate, and everyone will have their own dynamic in their own family and how that functions. When I was in the J07, the senior health officer role, putting my first group of Australians into that Role 3 hospital, I was concerned about how they would cope. Not because of any other reason, that it was high intensity. It's the type of injuries that we don't see in Australia. It can be very confronting. So I had the advantage of having a senior psychologist there in the headquarters with me, spoke with her and said, what can we do to give them a little bit more support? It's a 4-month deployment, so we organized for a halfway through deployment to do that. I then instituted and recommended that continue for my team. And you have to remind health professionals that we are humans too. We have vulnerabilities. We need to accept the fact that we might get affected by that. Most of us think we won't. But by sheer luck, we've been able to get through a lot of that, but many of our colleagues have not. And there have been times when very well-seasoned individual professionals have met with a complication or a problem that has affected them for the rest of their life. So we then talk about that post-traumatic stress disorder, that when we have a Royal Commission ongoing now about veteran suicide, defense of veteran suicide, it is telling. And I think the questions that you asked about your transition home, Australia's been very, very good at preparing people for that. They give us a time of decompression before we come back. We get our Return to Australia psychology screen. We identify people that are already showing signs of having issues. We require everyone to have a 3-month post-operational psychology screen to do those things. I do think that we do a very good job of taking care of our people, but there is no doubt that our people that are on the ground, especially those that are going out in harm's way, outside the wire, doing the patrols, doing those special operations, things that they do, there are risks. And for us as health professionals, yes, we're there. We're maybe not putting ourselves in harm, but we're seeing things that we would rather not see. But flipping that around, we are there because we want to be there to help those people. So that would just be the thing that I would always reflect on, that service comes with a price. Sometimes people's relationships break down, their interactions with their children, families break down, they themselves become mental health casualties. It is a real thing. We do what we do because we're there to help and to serve our country. It's the biggest bit of pride. That's why I keep on going. This has been 33 years of service so far. I'm still going. So it's always an honor. Anzac Day has come to mean a lot to me, but I didn't know about it growing up in Canada. I wouldn't have. I don't know why I would, growing up in Saskatchewan. So coming here the first year, I always, of course, knew about Remembrance Day, but I didn't know anything about Anzac Day. So it was very interesting to be part of that as my first year in service. But I had just come off of my officer training at that stage, the first year. But fast forward, I was deployed sometimes for Anzac Day. I was deployed in the UAE for that, and then later as a deployment to Iraq was deployed with the Anzac task force. So I've actually become an Anzac. But the first one, it was amazing to me the level of respect that I saw from the Australian public. Knowing what had happened to service people in the US, in Australia, in Canada who had served in Vietnam, where they didn't get recognition, that they didn't get a thanks of their country for putting themselves in harm's way and actually having casualties themselves. The Anzac Day, I was quite amazed at the size scale of it and the pride that I saw in the community from it. So it was something I had not known about in Canada. Had never experienced. So it was quite incredible. I didn't know what TUOP was. Didn't know any of those things. But Anzac Day has come to mean a lot. I've met some very, very good friends just at RSLs, and we've become a group of 4 of us that, from totally different realms of life, 2 sailors, an ex-serving Army sergeant. I'm getting his rank wrong. I think he was a staff sergeant. But we met there, and we've been friends ever since, and we go on trips together. So I think the Anzac spirit comes through. You see it on telly. You go to the marches. You go to the RSLs. You do the TUOP. You see the camaraderie. You see the respect of the community, and it's something that I'm always impressed by.